I'll never forget the sound of my brother-in-law Marcus's laughter echoing through my sister's pristine dining room in Millbrook Heights. It wasn't the kind of laugh you hear when someone tells a good joke. It was that cruel, dismissive kind that cuts through you like glass, the kind that tells you someone thinks you're beneath them. He was leaning back in his leather chair, wine glass in one hand, literally wiping tears from his eyes as he looked at my 16-year-old son, Kieran, who had just finished explaining his business idea with the kind of passion only teenagers possess. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wait, Marcus said, still chuckling as he turned to address the entire table of family members who had gathered for my sister Vivian's birthday dinner. Let me get this straight, kid. You want to sell, what did you call them? Custom pet portraits online. Like drawings of people's dogs? He made air quotes with his fingers, his voice dripping with condescension. And you think people are going to pay you real money for that? The table erupted in a chorus of barely suppressed snickers. My sister Vivian covered her mouth with her napkin, but I could see her shoulders shaking. Their teenage daughter, Sophia, didn't even try to hide her eye roll. Even my own mother, sitting at the head of the table in her Sunday best, let out what she probably thought was a gentle chuckle, but felt like a slap across the face. Kieran's cheeks flushed red, but he kept his chin up. He'd been so excited to share his idea with the family, had spent weeks preparing his little presentation on his laptop, complete with market research he'd done himself and sample artwork he'd created. He'd even printed out a business plan on paper he'd bought with his own allowance money. Now that stack of papers sat crumpled in his lap as 20 pairs of eyes looked at him like he'd just announced he wanted to become a professional unicorn trainer. "Mom," Kieran whispered to me, his voice barely audible over the continued laughter, "can we go home now?" My heart shattered. This was supposed to be a celebration, a family gathering where we shared good news and supported each other. Instead, it had turned into a public humiliation of my son's dreams. But before I could respond, Marcus wasn't done. He was on a roll now, performing for his audience. "Listen, Kieran," he said, leaning forward with that patronizing smile he'd perfected over his 15 years as a corporate lawyer. "I appreciate that you're thinking about business, I really do. But let me give you some free advice from someone who actually knows how the real world works." He gestured around the room, taking in the expensive artwork on the walls, the crystal chandelier, the imported furniture that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. "This is what success looks like. I didn't get here by drawing pictures of dogs." He paused for effect, making sure everyone was listening. "You want to make real money? Focus on your grades. Get into a good college. Study law, medicine, finance, something serious. Leave the arts and crafts to people who can afford hobbies." More laughter rippled through the room. My sister Vivian, ever the peacemaker, tried to soften the blow. "What Marcus means," she said in that sweet voice she used when she was about to say something cutting, "is that it's wonderful that you have creative interests, honey. But maybe you should think about more practical options for your future." She reached over and patted Kieran's hand like he was a confused child who had just suggested he could fly. That's when my mother decided to chime in. "You know, Kieran, when your mother was your age, she had all sorts of silly ideas too. She wanted to be an artist, a writer, all those impractical things. Look how that turned out." She gestured toward me sitting there in my department store dress, the single mom who worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat in our tiny apartment in Riverside Commons. The message was clear. Don't end up like your mother. But Kieran, God bless him, didn't back down completely. His voice was shaky, but he managed to speak up one more time. "I've already made $200, he said quietly. "Mrs. Henderson from down the hall paid me $50 for a portrait of her cat, and I sold 3 others online through Instagram." The laughter got louder. Marcus slapped the table. $200, he wheezed. Oh, well then, you're practically Warren Buffett already. Quick, someone call Forbes magazine. Even the adults who had been trying to be polite couldn't contain themselves anymore. Uncle David was shaking his head like he'd heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. Cousin Elena was texting on her phone, probably sharing this hilarious family moment with her friends. The only person not laughing was Kieran's 12-year-old cousin Mia, who looked almost as uncomfortable as my son did. I watched my baby boy shrink into himself, watched as every dream and hope he'd carefully cultivated over the past few months got trampled under the weight of their collective dismissal. These people, these successful, educated, wealthy people who were supposed to love and support him, had turned his moment of courage into a comedy show. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined as they sat there, in their designer clothes, sipping their expensive wine and laughing at a teenager's dreams, was that in exactly 18 months, that same ridiculous business idea would generate over $1.2 million in revenue. They didn't know that the quiet, determined kid they were mocking would be featured in Forbes magazine. Not as a joke, but as one of the youngest entrepreneurs to build a 7-figure business before graduating high school. They didn't know that their laughter would become the fuel that drove him to prove every single one of them wrong. And they definitely didn't know that the moment they were creating, this moment of public humiliation and family betrayal, would become the exact story Kieran would tell on stage at business conferences, in interviews with major publications, and in the Harvard Business School case study that would be written about his meteoric rise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to how we got to that dining room, and how a mother's quiet fury and a teenager's unshakable determination would turn a family dinner from hell into the origin story of a business empire. Because sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are the ones who end up eating their words. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Rachel Morrison, and I'm 38 years old. I live with my son Kieran in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Riverside Commons, about 40 minutes outside of downtown Burlington. It's not much. The kitchen faucet drips, the heater makes weird noises in winter, and our neighbor upstairs practices tap dancing at the most inconvenient times. But it's ours. More importantly, it's where Kieran learned that dreams don't require fancy zip codes to come true. I work 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Days, I'm a receptionist at Clearwater Medical Center, answering phones and scheduling appointments for Dr. Patel's family practice. It's steady work, decent benefits, but the pay barely covers rent and groceries. 3 evenings a week, I clean offices at the Meridian Business Complex downtown. It's not glamorous, crawling under desks to empty trash cans, scrubbing coffee stains out of conference room carpets, but it gives us just enough extra to handle emergencies, and maybe, occasionally, something fun. Kieran doesn't know that. I sometimes eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so he can have real meals. He doesn't know that I've been wearing the same 3 interview outfits for 5 years, rotating them carefully so my coworkers don't notice. He doesn't know that. I lie awake at night doing mental math, figuring out how to stretch $27 until my next paycheck. What he does know is that his mom believes in working hard, treating people with respect, and never giving up on the things that matter. My sister Vivian took a very different path. She married Marcus Whitfield right out of college, a match that our mother approved of so enthusiastically you'd think she'd arranged it herself. Marcus came from old money, the kind of family that has streets named after them in the nice part of town. He went to Ivy League schools, joined the right law firm, bought the right house in Millbrook Heights where every lawn looks like it was cut with scissors and every driveway has a luxury car that costs more than most people make in a year. Vivian transformed herself to fit into that world. She took tennis lessons, joined the country club, learned to say things like summer home and the help without a trace of irony. She hosts charity luncheons where women in $1,000 handbags discuss helping the less fortunate while eating, catered salads that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, Don't get me wrong, I don't resent her success. I just sometimes wonder if she remembers the girl who used to share a bedroom with me, who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, and who once cried for 3 hours when our goldfish died. The distance between our worlds became crystal clear when Kieran was born. Vivian had already started her family, Sophia, now 17, and their son Blake, who's 14. When I was pregnant and terrified, working double shifts to save money for baby expenses, Vivian would visit our tiny apartment like she was touring a museum exhibit. She'd sit carefully on our second-hand couch, decline my offers of coffee because she'd already had her morning latte, and give advice about parenting that sounded like she'd read it in magazines. "You really should consider private school," she'd say, watching 2-year-old Kieran play with blocks on our living room floor. "Education is so important, and the public schools in this area," she'd trail off with a concerned expression, as if the mere mention of public education might contaminate her designer shoes. But here's what Vivian never understood about Kieran. He didn't need private school to be brilliant. By age 5, he was reading chapter books and asking questions that made librarians pause and think. By 8, he was teaching himself to draw by watching YouTube videos on my ancient laptop, creating artwork that left his teachers speechless. By 12, he was building computers from spare parts he found at electronics recycling centers, somehow making outdated components work together in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Kieran has always been different. Not in a way that makes him struggle socially. He has plenty of friends and gets along with everyone. Different in the way that truly creative minds are different. He sees possibilities where other people see problems. He notices details that adults miss. He approaches everything with this infectious curiosity that makes you want to lean in and see the world through his eyes. When he was 13, Kieran started watching entrepreneur videos online. Not just the flashy, get-rich-quick stuff, but real business education content. He'd take notes in a spiral notebook, writing down concepts like market research and value proposition in his careful handwriting. He started reading books about business, borrowing them from the library because we couldn't afford to buy them, and discussing ideas with me over our simple dinners. "Mom," he'd say, gesturing with his fork, "did you know that most successful businesses start by solving a problem that people didn't even know they had?" Then he'd launch into explanations about market gaps and customer pain points, using terms I had to Google later to fully understand. I encouraged him because I could see the fire in his eyes when he talked about business. It was the same fire I'd once had about writing, before life convinced me that dreams were luxuries I couldn't afford. I refused to let anyone extinguish that fire in my son, especially not family members who thought success could only look one way. The art started as stress relief. Kieran had always been good at drawing, but in 8th grade, he began creating these incredibly detailed pet portraits. Not cartoon-like drawings, but realistic, emotional pieces that somehow captured the personality of the animals he drew. He'd spend hours working on a single piece, using techniques he'd taught himself through online tutorials and pure experimentation. Our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was the first person outside our apartment to really see his talent. She's this sweet elderly lady who lives alone with her ancient tabby cat, Mr. Whiskers. When Mr. Whiskers got sick last year, she was heartbroken. Kieran noticed her crying in the hallway one day and, without being asked, spent 3 weeks creating a portrait of her cat that captured every whisker, every expression line, every detail that made Mr. Whiskers special. When he gave it to her, she cried again, but this time from joy. She insisted on paying him $50, which was more money than Kieran had ever held at one time. But more importantly, she hung that portrait in her living room like it was a priceless masterpiece, and she told every visitor the story of the incredible young artist who lived down the hall. That's when the business idea was born. Kieran realized that pet owners would pay for custom artwork that captured their beloved animals in a way that photographs couldn't. He started researching the market, learning about pricing, understanding customer psychology. He created an Instagram account, posted samples of his work, and slowly began building a following. The day he made his first online sale to a stranger, a woman in Seattle who paid $75 for a portrait of her rescue dog, Kieran, came home from school practically glowing with excitement. He couldn't wait to tell the family about his business idea, about his plans to grow it, about his dreams of building something meaningful. That's how we ended up at Vivian's birthday dinner, with Kieran's carefully prepared presentation and his heart full of hope, walking straight into a room full of people who would mistake his vision for foolishness. None of them understood that they weren't just laughing at a business idea. They were laughing at everything that made Kieran who he was, his creativity, his determination, his belief that success didn't have to follow their predetermined path. And in doing so, they were about to unleash something they never saw coming. Thursday. Weeks leading up to Vivian's birthday dinner were some of the most exciting I'd seen Kieran in months. He'd been working on his business presentation like it was his senior thesis, staying up late researching market trends and printing out charts on our old inkjet printer that left streaky lines across every page. Our tiny kitchen table had become his makeshift office covered with sketches, customer feedback screenshots, and handwritten notes about pricing strategies. "Mom, look at this," he'd say every few days, sliding another piece of evidence across the table while I tried to eat my cereal before work. This lady in Portland paid me $85 for a portrait of her 2 cats together, and she left. A 5-star review saying it made her cry happy tears. His eyes would light up as he showed me the message, reading the customer's words aloud like they were poetry. I watched him calculate and recalculate his numbers, using the basic spreadsheet program on our laptop to track every sale, every expense, every potential profit margin. He'd figured out that if he could complete 3 portraits per week, which meant working every evening after school and most of Saturday, he could make about $300 monthly. For a 16-year-old with no other income, it was significant money. But for Kieran, it wasn't really about the money. It was about the validation that his idea could work, that people valued what he created. The best part, he told me one evening while working on a portrait of a golden retriever named Buster, is reading what the customers write when they see the finished piece. This guy yesterday said I captured something in his dog's eyes that he'd never seen in any photograph. He said I made him see his pet the way love sees, like, as this perfect, important soul instead of just an animal. The way Kieran talked about his customers wasn't just professional, it was personal. He genuinely cared about creating something meaningful for each person who trusted him with their beloved pet's image. He'd spend extra time getting the lighting right in a dog's eyes or perfecting the texture of a cat's fur, not because anyone would notice those details, but because he would know if they weren't perfect. 3 weeks before the dinner, Kieran announced that he wanted to share his business with the family. "I think they'd be proud of me," he said, organizing his presentation materials into a neat stack. "Aunt Vivian is always talking about being entrepreneurial, and Uncle Marcus understands business better than anyone. Maybe they could give me advice on how to grow it bigger." I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I didn't want to discourage him. Kieran had always seen the best in people, always assumed that others would share his enthusiasm for the things he cared about. He didn't understand yet that some people view success as a zero-sum game, that they might feel threatened by his achievements instead of proud of them. "That sounds wonderful, honey," I said, watching him practice his presentation in front of our bathroom mirror. "Just remember that not everyone understands creative businesses the way you do." But Kieran was unstoppable. He spent hours refining his pitch, creating a slideshow on our laptop that included customer testimonials, revenue projections, and even a competitive analysis he'd researched himself. He'd discovered that most custom pet portrait services charged between $200 and $500 per piece, making his prices extremely competitive while still allowing for growth. "I'm not trying to compete with the expensive artists," he explained to me as we reviewed his presentation together. I'm targeting people who love their pets and want something special, but can't afford to spend their rent money on artwork. There's this whole middle market that nobody's really serving well. The sophistication of his thinking amazed me. While his classmates were worried about video games and social media drama, Kieran was analyzing market segments and customer acquisition strategies. He'd even started a waiting list system because demand was outpacing his ability to complete portraits quickly. 2 days before the dinner, Kieran made a sale that changed everything for him. A woman in Denver had commissioned a portrait of her German Shepherd who'd recently passed away. She'd found Kieran through Instagram, looked through his portfolio, and specifically chosen him because she said his style captured the soul, not just the appearance of the animals he painted. When Kieran delivered the finished piece, the woman's response was unlike anything he'd received before. She wrote a long message explaining that her dog, Rex, had been her companion through cancer treatment, divorce, and job loss. The portrait, she said, didn't just show what Rex looked like, it showed who he'd been to her. She shared the artwork on her own social media with a caption about finding healing through art, and within 24 hours, Kieran had received 8 new commission requests. "Mom, this is it," he said, showing me the flood of messages and comments. "This is how businesses grow, through word of mouth from customers who really love what you do. I don't need a marketing budget or advertising. I just need to keep making people feel the way this lady felt when she saw Rex's portrait." The night before Vivian's dinner, Kieran could barely sleep. I could hear him in his room, practicing his presentation one more time, rehearsing the numbers and anecdotes he wanted to share. He'd printed everything on fresh paper, organized it in a neat folder, and even prepared answers to questions he thought they might ask about scaling the business or improving efficiency. "I'm going to tell them about the waiting list," he said over breakfast, barely touching his eggs because he was too excited to eat. "And the repeat customers. Mrs. Chen already commissioned 2 more portraits after seeing the first one I did of her Pomeranian. That's customer retention, right? That means the business model is working." I drove him to school that morning, watching him flip through his presentation materials one last time, muttering reminders to himself about which statistics to emphasize and which customer stories would resonate most with a business-minded audience. He'd even researched Marcus's law firm to understand what kind of corporate environment he was used to, hoping to speak his language. "Uncle Marcus always talks about ROI and market positioning," Kieran said as we pulled up to his school. I made sure to include data about both of those things. And Aunt Vivian is always posting about supporting small businesses on her social media, so she'll probably love that I'm creating my own instead of just working for someone else. As I watched him walk into school that morning, presentation folder tucked carefully under his arm, I felt a mixture of pride and protective worry that only parents understand. Pride because my son had built something real and meaningful through pure determination and creativity. Worry because he was about to share his most precious dream with people who might not have the wisdom to recognize its value. Kieran spent that entire school day telling his friends about the family presentation he'd be giving that evening. His art teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, had been following his business progress and wished him luck. His best friend, Jake, asked if he could come watch, thinking it sounded cooler than any PowerPoint I've ever seen. By the time I picked him up that afternoon, Kieran was practically vibrating with anticipation. He'd never had the chance to present his business to adults who understood corporate success, and he genuinely believed this would be the moment his family finally understood what he was building. Neither of us realized we were walking into an ambush disguised as a birthday celebration. Walking up the stone pathway to Vivian's house always felt like crossing into a different universe. The landscaping was immaculate, not a single leaf out of place, hedges trimmed into perfect geometric shapes, and seasonal flowers that looked like they'd been arranged by a magazine photographer. Even the doormat was spotless, as if dirt wouldn't dare cling to anything in this neighborhood. Kieran carried his presentation folder like it contained state secrets, his other hand smoothing down his button-up shirt every few steps. I'd helped him pick out his outfit that morning. his best khakis and the navy blue shirt we'd bought for his school's awards ceremony last year. He looked handsome and professional, but standing next to the gleaming luxury cars in Vivian's circular driveway, we both looked exactly like what we were. Visitors from a different economic reality. "Remember," I whispered to him as we approached the front door, "not everyone is going to understand your business the same way you do. Some people have very traditional ideas about success." "I know, Mom," he said, but his voice carried that confident optimism that only teenagers possess. "That's why I prepared all the financial data. Uncle Marcus loves numbers, and I've got plenty of those." The house itself was a monument to Marcus's success. 3 stories of brick and stone, with tall windows that probably cost more than our annual rent, and a front entrance that belonged in a luxury hotel. Everything about it whispered expensive, from the brass hardware to the imported tiles to the custom woodwork that had clearly been crafted by artisans who charged by the hour. Vivian answered the door wearing what I'd learned to recognize as her hosting outfit, something effortlessly elegant that probably came from a boutique where they serve champagne while you shop. Her smile was perfect, her makeup flawless despite having spent the day preparing for guests. She air-kissed my cheek and gave Kieran a quick hug that barely wrinkled her silk blouse. "Rachel! Kieran! So wonderful that you could make it," she said in that bright voice she used for social occasions. "Everyone's already here. Marcus is opening that bottle of wine we brought back from Napa, and Mother's been asking about you." The inside of the house was even more intimidating than the exterior. The foyer alone was larger than our living room, with a chandelier that cast prismatic light across marble floors that reflected our slightly scuffed shoes. Original artwork hung on the walls, not prints or reproductions, but actual paintings, with those little museum-style placards that mentioned the artists' names like they were supposed to mean something. As we walked through the house toward the dining room, I could hear the familiar sounds of Vivian's dinner parties, crystal glasses, clinking, sophisticated laughter, conversations about vacation destinations and stock portfolios and private school applications. These were the sounds of people who'd never worried about whether their electricity might get shut off or whether they could afford new school shoes. Kieran's eyes were wide as we passed through the living room, taking in the custom furniture, and the massive flat-screen TV mounted above a fireplace that probably cost more than most people's cars. But he wasn't intimidated. He was studying everything with the same analytical approach he brought to his business research. "This is beautiful, Aunt Vivian," he said genuinely. "Did you design all this yourself?" "Oh, heavens no," she laughed. "We have a decorator for that. Melinda comes highly recommended. She's done several houses in the neighborhood. You simply can't achieve this level of coordination without professional help." The dining room was set like something from a lifestyle magazine. The table could easily seat 12, covered with a tablecloth that looked like it had never seen a spill. The place settings included more forks than I knew what to do with, and the centerpiece was an elaborate floral arrangement that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Our family was already assembled around the table, and the contrast between our worlds became immediately apparent. Marcus sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, his expensive suit jacket draped over his chair, his Rolex catching the light from the chandelier. Uncle David and his wife Patricia had driven up from the city, both of them dressed in that casual but costly way that screams country club membership. Cousin Elena was there with her fiancé Brett, both fresh from their respective graduate programs, and eager to talk about their upcoming jobs at consulting firms with names that sounded like law offices. Even Vivian's kids, Sophia and Blake, looked like they'd stepped out of a prep school catalog, all perfect posture and expensive haircuts. And then there was my mother, sitting in the place of honor next to Marcus, wearing her best dress and the pearl necklace my father had given her 30 years ago. She looked proud to be included in this gathering of success stories, her eyes bright as she listened to Marcus discuss his latest high-profile case. "Rachel, dear, you look tired," she said as I leaned down to kiss her cheek. "Are you getting enough rest?" Overwork ages you. Before I could respond, Marcus was calling for everyone's attention. Now that the birthday girl's sister is here, I think we can begin our celebration properly. He raised his wine glass, and everyone else followed suit, except for Kieran and me, who had water glasses, and the younger cousins, who had sparkling cider. The dinner conversation flowed around topics I could barely contribute to. Real estate values in exclusive neighborhoods, private school rankings, vacation homes in places I'd only seen in magazines. Everyone spoke with the casual confidence of people who'd never had to check their bank balance before making a purchase, who discussed five-figure expenditures like, I talked about buying groceries. Kieran listened intently, occasionally asking polite questions that showed he was trying to understand their world. When Uncle David mentioned expanding his medical practice, Kieran asked thoughtful questions about business growth strategies. When Elena talked about her consulting work, he wanted to know about client acquisition and service delivery models. You're quite the little business student, Patricia observed with a patronizing smile. How adorable. That's when I started to feel the first tendrils of unease. The way they looked at Kieran when he spoke wasn't exactly hostile, but it wasn't respectful either. It was the way adults look at children who are trying to participate in grown-up conversations. Indulgent but dismissive, like they were humoring him until he inevitably said something that revealed his naivety. Marcus was the worst. Every time Kieran made a comment about business or entrepreneurship, Marcus would smile in that way that said he found the kid's interest cute, but ultimately irrelevant. That's an interesting observation, Kieran, he'd say, using the tone reserved for pets who'd learned a new trick. As the evening progressed, I could see Kieran becoming more animated, more excited about the possibility of sharing his own business success with this room full of accomplished adults. He kept touching his presentation folder, checking his phone for the time, waiting for the right moment to make his big reveal. Vivian, playing the perfect hostess, eventually noticed his anticipation. Kieran, you seem excited about something tonight. Do you have news to share with the family? And that's when everything shifted. The room's attention focused on my 16-year-old son, who straightened his shoulders and smiled with all the confidence of someone who believed his family would celebrate his achievements. Actually, yes, he said, reaching for his presentation folder. I've been working on something really exciting, and I was hoping to get some advice from everyone here about taking it to the next level. The way the adults exchanged glances should have been my first warning. The slight smirks, the raised eyebrows, the barely concealed amusement as they prepared to listen to what they clearly expected to be a teenage fantasy rather than a legitimate business presentation. But Kieran didn't see those warning signs. All he saw was a room full of successful people who were about to learn that the quiet kid from the modest side of the family had something worth celebrating too. Kieran opened his presentation folder with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. He pulled out his printed materials, arranged them neatly in front of him, and cleared his throat with the kind of nervous excitement that comes from having something important to share. The dining room fell into an expectant silence, but it wasn't the respectful kind you'd give a serious presenter. It was the indulgent, quiet adults offer children who are about to perform a song they learned at school. So, Kieran began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I've been running a custom pet portrait business for the past 8 months, and I wanted to share some of the results with everyone. He held up a laminated sheet showing before and after photos of his artwork alongside customer testimonials. I've completed 47 commissions so far, with a customer satisfaction rate of 100% and a growing waiting list. The first subtle signs of dismissal appeared immediately. Uncle David leaned back in his chair with a barely concealed smirk. Cousin Elena exchanged a glance with her fiancé that clearly said, "Here we go." Even my mother, who should have been proud of her grandson's initiative, looked slightly embarrassed, as if Kieran was about to reveal a secret hobby that wasn't quite appropriate for polite company. But Kieran, focused on his presentation, didn't notice these reactions. He was in his element now, pulling out his revenue charts and customer feedback screenshots. I've generated over $3,000 in the past 8 months, with my average commission price increasing from $50 to $95 as demand has grown. I've also developed a referral system that's brought in 30% of my new customers. Wait a minute, Marcus interrupted, setting down his wine glass with a slight clink that somehow sounded dismissive. You're telling us you've made $3,000 drawing pictures of people's pets? His tone carried that particular brand of disbelief reserved for things he considered beneath serious consideration. Yes, sir, Kieran replied, missing the condescension entirely. But it's not just drawing pictures. I do extensive research on each pet's personality, work with the owners to understand what makes their animal special, and create artwork that captures emotional connections, not just physical appearance. For example, "Oh my God," Sophia laughed, not bothering to cover her mouth. "You're literally running an arts and crafts business. That's so quaint." The word quaint hung in the air like a slap. Kieran's smile faltered for just a moment, but he pressed on, pulling out more documentation. "Actually, I've been studying the market, and there's significant demand for affordable custom pet art. Most professional animal portrait artists charge between $300 and $800 per piece, which puts them out of reach for middle-class pet owners who still want something meaningful to commemorate their animals." "Middle-class pet owners," Marcus repeated slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. "So your target market is people who can't afford real art." The room erupted in barely suppressed giggles. Patricia actually put her hand to her chest as if trying to contain her amusement. Blake, Vivian's 14-year-old son, was openly snickering while scrolling through his phone, probably texting friends about his weird cousin's business presentation. "It's not about affordability," Kieran said, his voice gaining an edge of desperation as he sensed the room turning against him. "It's about accessibility. I'm democratizing custom art. People shouldn't have to choose between paying rent and commemorating a beloved pet who..." "Democratizing art?" Marcus cut him off, and now he wasn't even trying to hide his amusement. "Kid, you're 16 years old. You have no idea what real business looks like. You think selling doodles on Instagram makes you an entrepreneur?" That's when the cruelty really began. What had started as condescending indulgence transformed into active mockery, and I watched my son's confidence crumble in real time as the people who were supposed to love and support him turned his greatest achievement into their evening's entertainment. "Marcus, don't be mean," Vivian said, but she was smiling as she said it, the kind of smile that encourages rather than discourages the behavior. "I think it's sweet that Kieran has a little hobby business. Very industrious." "A hobby business," Elena chimed in, emphasizing the word hobby like it was an insult. "That's adorable. What's next? A lemonade stand?" The laughter grew louder. Uncle David was actually wiping tears from his eyes. "Remember when you wanted to be a professional dog walker, Sophia? Same energy." "At least dog walking is a real service," Sophia shot back. "This is just, I don't even know what to call it. Digital finger painting?" Kieran's hands were shaking now as he tried to organize his papers, his carefully prepared presentations scattered and forgotten. "It's not finger painting," he said quietly. "I use professional digital art software. I study color theory and composition. I spend 15 to 20 hours on each piece." 20 hours! Marcus exploded with laughter. "So you're making what? $5 an hour? Congratulations. You've successfully created a business model that pays less than minimum wage." The mathematical humiliation hit Kieran like a physical blow. I could see him doing the calculation in his head, realizing that, when Marcus put it that way, his profitable business suddenly sounded like exploitation of his own labor. His face flushed red, and for the first time since he'd started presenting, he looked like what he was, a 16-year-old kid being publicly ridiculed by adults who should have known better. "But that's not..." He started, then stopped, his voice barely audible over the continued chuckling around the table. My mother, who had been quietly observing this massacre, decided to add her own contribution. "Kieran, dear, I think what everyone is trying to say is that it's wonderful you have creative interests, but you need to be realistic about your future. Your mother tried the artistic route, and look how that turned out." She gestured toward me with that particular brand of disappointed love that mothers specialize in. "You don't want to end up struggling like she has." The room fell into a momentary silence as everyone processed this double-barreled assault on both Kieran's dreams and my life choices. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation, not just for myself, but for what my son was witnessing. His own grandmother using his mother's struggles as a cautionary tale against pursuing his passions. "Grandma's right," Vivian added, her voice taking on that caring but firm tone she used when she thought she was being helpful. "Kieran, you're clearly very talented, and your heart is in the right place. But talent alone doesn't pay bills or build a real future. You need to think about college, about building a career that can actually support a family someday. Like what Uncle Marcus has built," Patricia added, gesturing around the opulent dining room. "This is what success looks like, honey. Not selling drawings to strangers on the internet." Brett, Elena's fiancé, decided to pile on with his own brand of corporate wisdom. "The gig economy is a trap, man. You think you're being entrepreneurial, but you're really just exploiting yourself. Real entrepreneurs build scalable businesses with recurring revenue and sustainable growth models." Kieran looked around the table, his presentation materials still clutched in his trembling hands, and I could see the exact moment when his excitement transformed into humiliation. These people, his family, the adults he'd looked up to and wanted to impress, had turned his proudest achievement into a punchline. "I do have recurring revenue," he whispered, making one last desperate attempt to salvage his presentation. "Mrs. Chen has commissioned 3 more portraits, and I have 8 customers on my waiting list for follow-up work." The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. It was the kind of silence that says, "This child doesn't understand how embarrassing he's being, and we're too polite to keep correcting him." Finally, Marcus delivered the killing blow with the casual cruelty that only comes from someone who's never had their dreams publicly dismantled. "Listen, kid," he said, leaning forward with mock sincerity. "I admire your enthusiasm, but let me give you some free advice from someone who actually understands how money works. $3,000 isn't a business. It's pocket change. When you're ready to talk about real money, real success, real impact on the world, then we'll have a conversation worth having." He picked up his wine glass and took a sip, signaling that the discussion was over. Around the table, conversations began to resume about topics these people considered worthy of their attention: stock portfolios, vacation planning, private school, applications. And Kieran sat there, still holding his presentation materials, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him look, as the people who were supposed to celebrate his achievements continued their dinner as if his dreams were too insignificant to deserve even polite acknowledgement. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity after Marcus's dismissal. Kieran sat frozen, his presentation materials still scattered in front of him, looking like he'd been physically struck. I was about to stand up, to end this humiliation and get my son out of there, when something unexpected happened. Kieran's phone, which had been sitting face down next to his water glass, began buzzing repeatedly. At first, he ignored it, too devastated to care about notifications. But the buzzing continued, not just once or twice, but in rapid succession, the kind of alert pattern that means something significant is happening. "Kieran," I said softly, nodding toward his phone, "you might want to check that." He picked up the phone with shaking hands, probably grateful for any excuse to break eye contact with the faces around the table that had just crushed his spirit. As he looked at the screen, his expression began to change. The devastation didn't disappear, but something else crept in, confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like shock. "What is it, honey?" I asked, loud enough that the table's attention began to shift back toward us, though most of them were still engaged in their own conversations about real estate values and wine selections. Kieran's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, I think something's happening." He was scrolling through his phone now, his eyes wide. "I'm getting order notifications, a lot of them." "Order notifications?" Marcus laughed, not even looking up from his conversation with Uncle David about golf handicaps. "What? Did someone order a whole pack of dog drawings?" But Kieran wasn't listening to Marcus anymore. He was staring at his phone like it contained information from another planet. "Mom," he said, his voice getting stronger, "I'm getting commission requests. Dozens of them. And they're not normal requests." "What do you mean, not normal?" I asked, leaning closer to look at his screen. "The prices," he said, his voice filled with bewilderment. "They're offering way more than I usually charge. This woman wants a portrait of her horse, and she's offering $300. This guy wants a painting of his entire pack of rescue dogs, and he's offering $800. This celebrity trainer wants portraits of all 6 of her show dogs, and she's—" He paused, blinking rapidly. "She's offering $2,000. The conversations around the table began to quiet as family members caught fragments of what Kieran was saying. Vivian looked over with mild curiosity, probably expecting another cute development in his little hobby business. "Celebrity trainer?" she asked with that indulgent smile. "Kieran, sweetheart, are you sure these aren't spam messages? People online pretend to be famous all the time." But Kieran was already pulling up Instagram on his phone, his fingers moving frantically across the screen. "No, look," he said, turning the phone so I could see. "This is her verified account. Melissa Hartwell. She has 2.3 million followers and she trains dogs for movies. She posted one of my older pieces, the German Shepherd portrait I did for that lady in Denver. And she wrote this whole caption about discovering emerging talent and supporting young artists." I looked at the screen and felt my breath catch. There it was, Kieran's artwork, professionally photographed and posted to an account with millions of followers. The caption was lengthy, praising the emotional depth and technical skill of the piece, talking about how rare it was to find an artist who could capture the true spirit of an animal, rather than just its physical appearance. "The post has been up for 3 hours, Kieran continued, his voice gaining strength as he processed what was happening. "It has 47,000 likes and over 2,000 comments. And people are tagging their friends, sharing stories about their own pets, asking how to commission their own portraits." The table had gone completely quiet now. Even Marcus had stopped mid-sentence in his golf story, though he was still trying to maintain his dismissive expression. "Let me see that," he said, reaching for Kieran's phone with the authority of someone used to fact-checking claims that seemed too good to be true. Kieran handed over the phone, and I watched Marcus's face change as he scrolled through the post. And the flood of comments. His smug confidence flickered for just a moment, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. "This is—" he started, then stopped, scrolling further. "How did she even find your work?" "Customer referral network," Kieran said. And for the first time since his presentation had begun, there was a note of quiet pride in his voice. "The woman in Denver who commissioned the German Shepherd portrait? She's connected to the dog training community. When she posted about Rex's portrait on her own social media, it caught the attention of other people in that world." Elena leaned over to look at Marcus's phone, her fiancé Brett peering over her shoulder. "Wait," she said, her voice losing its earlier mockery. "These aren't just random people. Look at these accounts. This veterinarian has 800,000 followers. This dog rescue organization has 1.2 million. This pet food company is asking about commercial licensing." "Commercial licensing?" Patricia asked, the casual dismissal gone from her voice. Kieran's phone buzzed again in Marcus's hands. then again. Then it started buzzing continuously, a steady stream of notifications that filled the silence of the dining room like a drumbeat. "It's not stopping," Marcus said, staring at the screen with growing bewilderment. "These are all commission requests, business inquiries, partnership proposals." He looked up at Kieran with an expression I'd never seen him wear before. Not quite respect, but definitely not dismissal either. "Kid, how many followers do you have on Instagram?" "I had about 1,500 this morning," Kieran said quietly. "But..." He took his phone back and checked his profile. "I'm at 9,000 now, and it's climbing." The numbers were surreal. In the 3 hours since Melissa Hartwell's post had gone live, Kieran's small pet portrait business had exploded into something none of us could have imagined. The commission requests weren't just coming from individual pet owners anymore. They were coming from businesses, influencers, organizations with serious money and serious reach. This veterinary clinic wants to commission portraits of their therapy animals for their lobby, Kieran read from his messages. This pet insurance company wants to discuss a partnership where I create portraits for their premium customers. He paused, his voice catching. This gallery in Nashville wants to discuss a solo exhibition of pet portraits. Uncle David, who had been listening with growing interest, finally spoke up. What kind of money are we talking about here? Total value of these requests? Kieran scrolled through his messages, doing quick mental calculations. If I accepted everything that's come in just in the past 3 hours, probably around $30,000. But that's not counting the business partnerships or licensing deals, and I don't even know how to price those. The silence that followed was completely different from the earlier dismissive quiet. This was the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew about the teenager sitting at their table. Blake, Vivian's son who had been mocking Kieran just minutes earlier, leaned forward with new interest. Dude, you went viral. Like, actually viral. Do you realize what this means? I don't think any of us realize what this means, Vivian said slowly, looking at Kieran like she was seeing him for the first time. Kieran, honey, this is extraordinary. But the most telling moment came when Marcus, the corporate lawyer who had just finished explaining why $3,000 wasn't real money, handed Kieran's phone back to him and said something I never thought I'd hear from him. You might want to think about getting a business manager and a lawyer. This is moving beyond what a 16-year-old should be handling alone. Kieran looked around the table at the faces that had been mocking him just minutes before, now staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to calculation to something that might have been envy. The same presentation materials that had been dismissed as childish hobby work were still scattered in front of him, but now they looked like the foundation documents of something much larger than anyone had imagined. The thing is, Kieran said quietly, his voice steady now despite everything that had just happened, this isn't really about going viral or getting famous. It's about what I've been trying to tell you all evening. There was always a market for this work. There were always customers who valued what I was creating. The only thing that changed is the scale. He began gathering his presentation materials, organizing them back into their neat stack. I wasn't wrong about the business model. I wasn't wrong about the demand. I wasn't wrong about the value of what I was offering. He looked directly at Marcus. I was just operating in a smaller market than I realized existed. The transformation, in the room, was complete. The same adults who had spent the evening laughing at his dreams were now asking serious questions about his business strategy, his capacity to scale, his plans for managing sudden success. But something had fundamentally changed in Kieran, too. He answered their questions politely, but without the eager-to-please excitement he'd had at the beginning of the evening, because now he knew something he hadn't known before. His business was real whether they believed in it or not. The drive home from Vivian's house was unlike any car ride Kieran and I had ever shared. He sat in the passenger seat, still clutching his phone as commission requests continued to pour in. his face illuminated by the constant glow of notifications. But there was something different about his expression now. Not the crushing disappointment from earlier, but a quiet, almost analytical focus as he processed what had just happened. "Mom," he said finally as we stopped at a red light, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Of course, honey. What is it?" When Uncle Marcus was laughing at my business tonight before everything changed, you think he was right? Did you think I was just being naive? The question hit me harder than I expected. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, choosing my words carefully. "I thought you were brave," I said. "I thought you were passionate and hardworking and incredibly talented. But honestly, I did worry that maybe you were moving too fast, dreaming too big too soon." He nodded slowly. "That's what I figured. And you know what? That's okay. Because I was doubting myself too, right up until I saw that Instagram post. But now I understand something I didn't before." "What's that?" "The problem was never my business or my prices or my market research. The problem was that I was asking for validation from people who fundamentally don't understand how modern business works." He turned to look at me directly. "Uncle Marcus builds his success on billable hours and corporate clients who have no choice but to pay his fees. That's not the same as building something from nothing and creating value that people actually want to pay for." The maturity in his voice startled me. This wasn't the excited teenager who had walked into that dinner party. This was someone who had been tested and had come through the fire with a clearer understanding of his own worth and capabilities. When we got home to our small apartment, Kieran immediately set up his laptop on our kitchen table and began responding to the flood of inquiries. But he wasn't just accepting every offer that came in. He was evaluating each one, asking questions about scope and timeline, negotiating terms with a professionalism that would have impressed the business executives who had mocked him hours earlier. "This gallery in Nashville," he said, showing me an email chain, "they want to do a solo exhibition, but they're also talking about a percentage of sales that seems too high. I'm going to counter-propose with different terms." "Do you know how to negotiate gallery contracts?" I asked. "Not yet," he said with a grin that reminded me he was still 16. "But I know how to research, and I know what my work is worth. Plus, Mrs. Rodriguez at school used to work in art curation before she became a teacher. I'm going to ask if she can help me understand the industry standards." Over the next few hours, I watched my son handle his sudden success with a level-headedness that amazed me. He created a spreadsheet to track all the inquiries, sorted them by priority and profitability, and began developing a systematic approach to managing the demand. When a pet food company reached out about licensing his artwork for their premium packaging, he didn't immediately say yes. He researched their brand, looked at their customer base, and considered how the partnership would align with his own business values. "I don't want to just take every opportunity," he explained as he worked. "I want to build something sustainable. This viral moment won't last forever, but if I make smart decisions now, I can use it to create something that will." The next morning brought even more surreal developments. Kieran's Instagram following had grown to over 30,000 overnight. Local news outlets had picked up the story of the teenage entrepreneur whose pet portrait business had exploded through social media. The phone started ringing early with interview requests from business podcasts and local television stations. But the most significant call came from someone I never expected to hear from. "Marcus." "Rachel," he said when I answered, his voice carrying none of the condescension from the night before. "I owe you and Kieran an apology. More than that, I owe you a conversation about how we can help him navigate what's happening." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly what he meant. "He's going to need legal help. Contract review, business incorporation, intellectual property protection. This is beyond what a teenager should be handling without professional guidance. I'd like to offer my services." I almost laughed. The same man who had spent the evening explaining why Kieran's business wasn't real was now volunteering to provide legal services for that exact business. That's very generous, Marcus, but we can't afford corporate legal fees. I'm not talking about fees, he said quickly. I'm talking about family helping family. I was wrong last night, Rachel. Completely, embarrassingly wrong. Let me make it right. When I told Kieran about Marcus's offer, his response surprised me. I appreciate that he wants to help, he said. Carefully, but I need to think about whether working with someone who didn't believe in my business until it became profitable is the right choice for me. That afternoon, Vivian called, then my mother, then Elena. Each conversation followed the same pattern: apologies for the previous evening, followed by offers to help, followed by not-so-subtle hints about how they might be able to contribute to Kieran's success. Vivian wanted to introduce him to her wealthy friends who owned expensive pets. My mother suggested he could use her connections in the local art community. Elena thought her consulting background could help him develop growth strategies. It's interesting, Kieran observed after the third call. How quickly people want to be part of your success once it becomes obvious to everyone else. But the call that mattered most came from someone unexpected. His 12-year-old cousin Mia, Vivian's youngest daughter, who had been silent during the dinner party disaster. Kieran, she said in her quiet voice, I wanted to tell you that I thought your presentation was really cool last night, even when everyone was being mean. I saved up my allowance because I want to commission a portrait of my hamster, Mr. Whiskers. But I wanted to ask you before everything got crazy and expensive. The fact that a 12-year-old had seen the value in his work when the adults couldn't seem to affect Kieran more than any of the high-dollar commissions or business opportunities. Mia, he said, Mr. Whiskers is going to be my first official commission under my new pricing structure, and I'm going to make it the best portrait I've ever created. That evening, as we sat at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd prepared his presentation materials, where he'd doubted himself, where he'd learned to believe in his own vision despite everyone else's skepticism, Kieran made a decision. That would define how he approached not just his business, but his relationships with the family members who had dismissed him. I'm going to be polite to everyone who wants to help now, he said. But I'm not going to forget who believed in me when it wasn't obvious, and who didn't. Uncle Marcus can help with legal stuff because that's practical, and I need it. But I'm not going to let people rewrite history and pretend they supported me all along. He looked up from his laptop, where he was designing a portfolio website to handle the flood of professional inquiries. The most important thing I learned last night wasn't about business or success. It was about the difference between people who support your dreams and people who only support your results. As I watched him work late into the night, responding to emails from galleries and corporate clients, turning his childhood bedroom into a makeshift business headquarters, I realized that Marcus's cruel laughter had accomplished something he never intended. It had forced Kieran to find his confidence from within, rather than seeking validation from others. And that internal confidence, built through humiliation and tested by sudden success, would prove to be the foundation of everything that came. After 18 months later, I stood in the back of a packed auditorium at the Burlington Convention Center, watching my son deliver the keynote address at the Regional Young Entrepreneurs Summit. The same kid who had been humiliated at a family dinner was now speaking to an audience of 500 business leaders, sharing the stage with executives from Fortune 500 companies and venture capital firms. The most valuable lesson I learned. In building my business, Kieran said from behind the podium, his voice carrying the confident authority that comes from proven success, wasn't about market research or customer acquisition. It was about the difference between people who believe in your vision and people who only believe in your results. In the audience, I could see several familiar faces. Marcus and Vivian sat in the third row, having driven up from Millbrook Heights to attend what Marcus now proudly referred to as my nephew's speaking engagement. My mother was there too, beaming with the kind of pride that comes with being associated with unexpected success. Even Elena had flown in from her consulting job in Chicago, eager to network at an event where her cousin was the featured speaker. But the person who caught my attention was sitting in the front row. Mia, now 14, wearing a t-shirt featuring one of Kieran's pet portraits and taking notes in a journal she'd brought specifically to capture her cousin's advice. She'd been the first family member to genuinely support his business, and she remained the one whose opinion he valued most. The numbers Kieran shared during his presentation were staggering even to me, and I'd been living through his success daily. His pet portrait business had generated $1.4 million in revenue over the past 18 months. He now employed 12 freelance artists working under his creative direction, had licensing deals with 3 major pet food companies, and had opened a brick-and-mortar gallery space in downtown Burlington that featured rotating exhibitions of animal art. Success isn't just about the money, Kieran continued, clicking to a slide showing customer testimonials. It's about impact. We've created over 2,000 custom portraits that help families remember beloved pets who've passed away, celebrate new adoptions, and strengthen the emotional bonds between people and their animals. Every piece we create becomes part of someone's most treasured memories. The Harvard Business School case study he'd mentioned during that awful dinner had indeed been written, and it was now taught in entrepreneurship courses across the country. As an example of how social media could transform a small service business into a scalable enterprise. Business journals had featured his story, and he'd been invited to speak at conferences from Miami to Seattle. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came after his presentation, during the networking reception. I watched as several family members approached Kieran, eager to associate themselves with his success, while he handled each interaction with polite professionalism but clear boundaries. When Marcus pulled him aside to discuss expansion opportunities and mentioned his connections in corporate law, Kieran listened respectfully but didn't commit to anything. "I appreciate the offer, Uncle Marcus," he said, "but I've already established relationships with advisors who believed in my vision from the beginning." The contrast between this confident young businessman and the devastated teenager from that dinner party was remarkable. Kieran had learned to value his own judgment above the opinions of others, to build his team based on competence and loyalty rather than family connections, and to measure success by his own standards rather than external validation. Later that evening, as we drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside Commons, past the apartment where his business had started at our kitchen table, Kieran reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. "You know what's funny?" he said, watching the neighborhood shift from the convention center's downtown location to our modest community. "I used to think that dinner at Aunt Vivian's was the worst thing that could have happened to my business. But now, I realize it was exactly what I needed." "How do you figure that?" I asked. "Because it forced me to stop seeking validation from people who didn't understand what I was building." When Uncle Marcus laughed at my $3,000 in revenue, it hurt so much that I had to decide whether I believed in my own work or whether I was going to let other people's limited vision define what was possible for me. He paused, watching the streetlights pass by our car window. If they had been supportive that night, if they had praised my presentation and offered encouragement, I might have been satisfied with staying small. I might have accepted their version of success instead of pursuing my own. The psychological transformation was as significant as the financial one. Kieran had learned that the most dangerous critics aren't the ones who attack your dreams. They're the ones whose approval you desperately want, but who lack the vision to see what you're capable of achieving. 3 months after the conference, Kieran made a decision that surprised everyone, including me. He announced that he was establishing a scholarship fund for young entrepreneurs from working-class families, providing both financial support and business mentorship for teenagers who had innovative ideas but lacked the resources to pursue them. "Want to help kids who are sitting at their own kitchen tables right now, working on business plans that their families might not understand?" he explained when he announced the program. "Kids who need someone to believe in their vision before the world validates it." The first scholarship recipient was a 15-year-old girl from the south side of Burlington who had developed a food delivery service specifically for elderly residents. Her own family had dismissed it as too complicated and not realistic. Kieran saw something different. A young entrepreneur who understood her market and had identified a genuine need. As I write this story now, Kieran is 19 and studying business at Stanford University while continuing to run his company remotely. His success has opened doors I never could have imagined when we lived paycheck to paycheck in our small apartment. But more importantly, it's given him something that no amount of money can buy. Unshakable confidence in his own judgment and an understanding that true support comes from people who believe in your dreams, not just your results. The family dynamics have settled into a new normal. Marcus and Vivian are proud to claim association with Kieran's success, and he's gracious about their involvement while maintaining clear boundaries about who influences his major decisions. My mother tells everyone about her entrepreneurial grandson, conveniently forgetting her earlier warnings about following in his impractical mother's footsteps. But the relationship that matters most to Kieran is still the one with Mia, who now works part-time for his company while finishing high school, learning business skills that no traditional education could provide. She's the family member who gets the first look at new projects, whose opinions carry real weight in business decisions, whose loyalty was proven when it cost her nothing to give it. Sometimes I think about that terrible dinner party and wonder, what would have happened if the family had been supportive, if they had celebrated Kieran's early success instead of mocking it? Would he have pushed himself as hard? Would he have developed the internal resilience that now defines him? Would he have learned to trust his own vision above all else? I'll never know the answers to those questions, but I do know this. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give a young person isn't encouragement. It's the motivation that comes from having to prove everyone wrong. Kieran's business succeeded not despite the mockery he faced, but because of what that mockery taught him about believing in himself when no one else would. And every time I see him speak at conferences, mentor young entrepreneurs, or make decisions, based on his own carefully considered judgment rather than others' expectations, I'm reminded that success isn't just about reaching your goals. It's about who you become in the process of pursuing them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.